So thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to take just a few minutes as people continue to join us to give you some highlights about other programs that are coming up during this year's NEA Big Read in the St. Croix Valley. As you may know, our event with Joy Harjo that is been moved online and will be Monday night. So please plan to join us on that event. She's going to be joined by Hyde Erdrich for a conversation. And we will then move on to the next week. Well, that is next week. Oh boy. Thursday night, the 21st, lecture with Dr. Brenda Child about the tradition of the jingle dress and the jingle dress dance that was built, that was created after the 1919 flu pandemic. So maybe we can imagine the kind of art that will, healing arts that will come out of this pandemic. And I'll talk more about other events in the St. Croix Valley after Dr. Treuer's event tonight. But of course, ongoing through May 7th is Jim Denemy Sweet Dreams on view at ArtReach St. Croix Gallery here in Stillwater. So I think we should get started. As I mentioned, you're all muted and you can have your video speaker mode. Welcome to the Big Read in the St. Croix Valley. And I'm Heather Rutledge, Executive Director at ArtReach St. Croix. We acknowledge that ArtReach St. Croix occupies land that is the ancestral home of the Wapakuta people and the larger Osheti-Shakoween Seven Fires Council Alliance of Dakota Tribes. The Dakota people today are here and maintain deep connections to this land and its stories, despite genocide and forced relocation. ArtReach St. Croix will build and strengthen relationships with Indigenous people who currently or in the future call the St. Croix Valley home. ArtReach looks to amplify artists' voices and to each other. And that's really the intention of the Big Read. This is the 8th year, and I can tell you the whole idea behind the Big Read is that it is partners from all over the valley that come together and make this whole thing happen, including a bunch of the library partners. The NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. And it's presented by ArtReach in conjunction with our core program partners, including Valley Bookseller and library branches located between St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin and Hastings, Minnesota. So I am going to turn over the hosting to Aurora Jacobson, who's my partner across the street at the Stillwater Public Library, and she'll introduce Dr. Treuer.
Dr. Anton Treuer is a professor of Ojibwe at sorry, I had to make sure I was unmuted. Is professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University and author of more than 20 books. His equity, education, and cultural work has put him on a path of service around the region, the nation, and the world. He has a BA from Princeton University and an MA and PhD from the University of Minnesota. He is editor of the Oshakabewis Native Journal, the only academic journal of the Ojibwe language. Treuer has also worked extensively with the Ojibwe language immersion efforts underway in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ontario. He is part of a team of scholars developing Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe with the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe. Treuer is also on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society, and in 2018, he was named Guardian of Cultural and Lifeways and recipient of the Pathfinder Award by the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Dr. Treuer was also my favorite professor in grad school a long, long time ago. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and it's great to see you all. Maji tayan niwi ojibwem ajanes mietago dewin de munagug awian wagosh indigu minawa migazi and dodem wasawad ishkondigan wanjibayan jimekag. I'm just really excited to see you all and to be in conversation with you. I'm going to get us queued up for a conversation, but start thinking about your questions, because we're going to hold a fair amount of our time together to field those. And we've got a little over 100 people in the room, so we'll probably make best use of the chat functions and things like that. But if anybody needs to unmute for when we get to Q&A, by all means, feel free to do that. I was just giving you a brief shout out in my Ojibwe language to let you know that my native name is Wagush, and that means fox. And I come from the Eagle clan. In the Ojibwe culture, we have a clan system that have animals, birds, fish. They're kind of a symbol for your family, but also a spiritual guide. So Eagle is my clan. And I come from Leech Lake, which is one of the Ojibwe communities in northern Minnesota, epicenter of the universe, although not everybody knows it yet. And I'm quite familiar with your area. I was actually great friends with Archie Mose, the late Archie Mose, who is a spiritual leader from the St. Croix tribe, born in 1901, passed away in 1996. He was about 12, first time he met a white man, and he was in his 30s, first time he saw a car. Of course, when I met him, he was in a modern house watching WWF SmackDown on a TV and laughing really loud. And it was always amazing to me to think about the changes that he saw during his lifetime. So once we get to questions too, feel free to ask about the personal as well as the professional, and you can steer me in whatever directions you want to go in. I do have a PowerPoint that I'll share with you here. And after we get rolling, you can start asking questions. And by the way, as I go, you can also drop them into the chat at any time, and I'll start going through those as we go. So this is a picture of Tom Stillday. He was another one of my mentors and elders. He passed away in about 2007. And he was the first person who was named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate, who was not from one of the Abrahamic religious traditions. And so that was him with his pipe opening up the Senate. He had such a great sense of humor too. He'd say, I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it. And that was before all of the current crazy that we've been going through the past, several years here. And he was fun. I work at a university, Bemidji State, and we have this graduation event for our Native students. And I said, well, let's bring in Tom. He's got a PhD in the School of Life, and he'll have a really relatable story to share with our students. And so they brought him in, and then on the side, I had to talk to Tom, who's notoriously long-winded. And I said, Tom, this is a graduation event. You got to keep this one short, 10 to 15 minutes, focus on the students, throw in a joke, and you'll be good. And he got up there and just wrecked the agenda. He spoke for about an hour and a half. He did it all in Ojibwe. He didn't use a word of English, and we were in mixed company. And then when he was done, he said, all you people who study Indians, study that. And he went and sat down. So I thought he was hilarious, but he had some good points, like most of the books written about Native people have been written by non-Native people, and many of whom haven't spent much time in a Native place or in the company of many Native people. And so they're using things like, what did the white army officer write in his journal as the sources to understand the Native experience? But how's that going to get you Native perspectives on anything? So it's not just the history books. I'd say this is often what has gone wrong with policy things, like somebody came up with the idea of taking kids away from their families and sending them to residential boarding schools. to help them. And if they had actually had a deeper conversation with the Native families that this would affect, probably wouldn't have come up with the same idea. It's the same thing with the school turnaround plan, the suicide prevention plan, so many different things. And one of the things that's very exciting to see in just over the past 20, 30 years is there's been an explosion of Native authored books, Native people, penetrating all kinds of professions and getting the microphone more, and Native people having a lot more voice in the shaping of policy that affects Native people. And so this is an emerging effort, but one that is encouraging and leads me to believe that, we're at least trying to move in the right directions. And not just Native people, but others too are really trying to do right by Native folks. So here's home for me. Leech Lake's right in the middle of northern Minnesota. And my ancestral village of Bena is population 400, and half of them are my cousins. That's actually not an exaggeration. These are a couple folks from my family tree. I was mentioning briefly Archie Mosé with his long life. This guy on the left with the super ancient face, he got the name John Smith later in life, which I always thought was ironic. No connection to the one from Pocahontas mythology. But he was born in the 1700s and he died in 1922. Can you imagine that? Was pretty dang close to the record, for human longevity. But he was in our area before there was any white settlement, and he was still here, after the soldiers came back from World War I. Kind of incredible to think of the changes that he saw during his lifetime. I think I have this nose, but I'm working on all of the wrinkles and stuff like that. On the other side of the screen is Wabujig, who's kind of a famous warrior in the Ojibwe world. He actually came out of Wisconsin his father came out of Wisconsin from La Pointe, Madeline Island area, through St. Croix, and then eventually moved into central Minnesota, where Wabujig the Younger was born. And, when I was a kid, I didn't really have the tools to talk about this, but as I got older, it started to bother me a little bit that I could go to school, kindergarten and 12 grades to learn whatever I needed to be successful in the world. And none of it had anything to do with me. It was kind of like the message that was screaming at me through the absent narratives was that you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. And I resisted that, kind of got a chip on my shoulder. And I think even today, a lot of our professionals in the education universe look around and think, why do we have truancy issues with some of these BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous, people of color? And I'm like, that one is flight. And how come we have discipline issues? And I'm like, that one is fight. How come some of those Native kids are like spaced out, zoned out, disengaged, or hanging out at the Indian Ed office? And I'm like, that one's freeze. And although, of course, something as complex as education is not as simple as fight, flight, freeze, but I do think this is a dynamic that's affecting things. And this is also part of the answer to the riddle. Why are things like Ojibwe language immersion schools or other Indigenous medium schools having so much academic success with the kids? And part of it is they're making it possible for those kids to learn about themselves as well as the rest of the world. And that's something that is pretty new in American education. Yeah, so I'm catching up a little bit in the chat. It's fine if somebody wants to record this. Not sure, that's kind of up to the librarians there. And I can see some questions coming up, so that's awesome. And I'll be getting to these as we get into the Q&A, and appreciate you sharing those. So these are some pictures of my dad, who is not Native at all. He was actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant, a Holocaust survivor. He spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. He has an amazing story, or really like series of stories for different chapters of his life. And I could fill our whole time just with that. I'll give you a kind of shorter version of it, which is that, you know, he got out of there at age 13, took a year to get to the US. Once he got here and got his US citizenship, a couple years later, he lied about his age. At age 17, signed up for the US Army. He wanted to go kill Nazis, but they sent him to the Pacific Theater. He was stationed in the Philippines. And eventually he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. That's the short version. My mom grew up in a little village of Bena in the heart of the Leech Lake Reservation. And when she was a kid, you know, in addition to navigating, you know, pretty remarkable poverty, she only met one professional Native person ever. And that person was the school nurse. And she thought, well, maybe I can do that. And so she graduated from high school and went to nursing school. And then one of her first jobs, she came back home to work for the tribe's health program. And she thought, wow, Native people are getting kicked around. I'm going to do something about that. And she went on and got a law degree. And she was actually the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. So that was pretty cool. Feel free to ask questions about them as we go. This is just some information on like economics from the village of Bena, where we come from. And I sometimes hesitate to even show a slide like this. And the reason I hesitate is because it can reinforce one of the stereotypes about Natives. Because one of them says we're all living in squalor on a reservation somewhere. Of course, there's another one that says we're all rich from casinos. Sometimes you'll hear both of those from the same person, and they won't even try to reconcile them. The reality is it's kind of complex. So in the state of Wisconsin, and the same is true in the state of Minnesota, in 16 counties in Wisconsin and just a little bit more in Minnesota, tribes are not just big employers, but they are the biggest employers of all. Better be nice to Natives. You're probably going to end up working for one someday. And at the same time, about 50% of Native kids live below the poverty line. So the truth is it's kind of complex. There's a great TED Talk, by the way, by this Nigerian literary figure. Her name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If you can't remember that, don't sweat it. The title is much easier. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. The Danger of a Single Story. It's totally worth the 15 minutes. And in The Danger of a Single Story, among the great things she shares is that the problem with stereotypes is not so much that they are incorrect, as much as they are incomplete. And they give you a narrow, single story narrative to understand the experience of a whole group of people. So, you know, for the sake of irony, let's say we wanted to study white people in America, and we only looked at poverty in rural Appalachia. Well, that wouldn't tell you everything you need to know about the white experience. It wouldn't even tell you everything you need to know about the white experience in Appalachia. And similarly, if you just studied, you know, wealthy white people on New York's Upper East Side and thought, wow, talk about everything handed on a silver platter, that also wouldn't tell you everything you need to know about the white experience in America. But if you actually do something like study white people in America, you have so many narratives to look at. If you turn on the TV, you'll see stories about white people who are good guys, bad guys, you know, good guys breaking bad, bad guys turning good. And you get a variety of things. And you're not going to like watch one show like Psycho and think, wow, I'm terrified of white people. You just know it's a story. But when you're looking at another group of people like Indigenous people, if you flick on your TV, you will see more movies and images of aliens than Native Americans. And so that means we get left to our imagining a lot. And it's easier to latch on to one of these single story narratives, whether it's one of poverty or wealth from casinos or whatever, and miss all of the complexity and diversity to that experience. So when my folks were getting started, I guess you could say my dad was hitting the restart button. My mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. They had some humble beginnings. So they had a little house and it didn't actually have electricity or running water for a time. We had a hand pump for cranking water out of the ground. We had an outhouse. We had kerosene lanterns. This is me as a tyke. We'd wash up in the creek in the summer, enamel wash basins in the winter. I never felt poor, never had food insecurity. Those actually remain quite happy memories from my childhood. But of course, I saw big changes. I mentioned, and I was probably right at the time I was entering middle school when my mother got her law degree and built a nice house for our family, and our economic profile changed. And that revealed to me the true power of an education. It's undeniable. There are many stories of people, be they immigrants or indigenous people or any number of things, who didn't have special financial advantage or racial advantage, but found ways to make it work. And it's really one of the most beautiful things about America. At the same time, I'm kind of with George Carlin. I don't know if you remember that old comedian. And he said, we call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. And by that, what I think he really meant was that there are barriers out there, and those barriers are not equitably distributed by race, by gender, by sexual orientation, by all kinds of things. And so it's important to generate some awareness of all of those variables and how they are all impacting us really all the time. Yeah, but I think it was quite formative for me watching my mom. She was usually the only woman in court. She was the only native in court, having her powwow braids and Indian Health Service Coke bottle eyeglasses and a suit, fighting with a fact. And I think that helped me believe, well, I can do stuff too then. And the importance of role models in her experience and mine, I think still bears a lot of weight with me. This is my crew. So there are 9 kids, a big, beautiful blended family. It is never dull. This picture is a few years old now. So we have 3 kids left at home. We launched 6 out the door. And now they're reproducing on their own. There's 3 grandkids in the mix. My wife's in the middle of the pile here. She is a little hard to see, but she's got blonde hair and blue eyes. So she's from the Swedish American tribe. Somebody's getting along out there. She's pretty interesting to talk to too. She's one of the only white people I know who knows what it's like not to see another white person for long periods of time. That included being shut in a house with this crew during the pandemic, but it also is when we go to ceremonies and things like that. And she'll be the only, non-native person in that space, sometimes for a couple of weeks on end. And so that's a good perspective builder too. This is the view off the front deck of my house. I kind of feel like Shrek. That's my swamp. But among things that had happened when my folks got started is they acquired this piece of property for really relatively little money. And when they got it, it did not look like this. It actually looked like this. Wide open farm fields. That's my dad on the tractor with my brother. And what they did is they started to plant trees. And in fact, they planted all of the trees in this picture here. And it completely transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. Just a couple people, granted they had a child labor force, that's me. But what a change. And I think for a lot of us, we're all pitiful humans trying to figure things out. And we look around and we think about all the problems we're bequeathing to our youngest generation. Climate change, race relations, politics. And we look at that stuff and think, oh, there's not a lot I can do about that. I'll try to be a decent human. I'll tell my kids to be decent humans, and I hope it's enough. And it's never quite enough, because all that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. But it's not like we need to take this mountain of problems humans have been making for thousands of years and move that whole mountain right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can transform the entire landscape and the ecosystem. And that's really the work that we're engaged in when we do education, when we do any kind of community service, when we travel, when we even pull together events like this it creates opportunity for us to plant the seeds. And it's always a reciprocal process. I learn as much from the people I have conversations with as they do from me. And I've never met a single human on this planet who is not my superior in some way. We all have something to teach, and we all have something to learn too. And so that reminder about humility with everything we do has always been helpful to me. So I get to wear many hats. So one of them is I'm a rare, lucky guy in many ways, including that although I'm an academic, I get to live in my home community. And so we do a lot of stuff like this. Here we are with the kids harvesting wild rice. This time of year, we still have snow up here. So we're busy. I don't know if you can even see all that. It's kind of sunny now. But, we're doing maple syrup and sugar. And those things are really, I think, fulfilling for me in a number of ways. One, I like to eat the food Monsanto hasn't dumped a bunch of chemicals on. I like participating in the cultural activities that our ancestors did. And I like the way that it gets everybody in the family out in the woods together. And there's kind of an intergenerational sharing of family and community practice with that. And then the kids kind of walk around and they're like, they know how to get food out of a tree. They know the science of that, but they know the culture of that too. And that translates into, I know how to do stuff. And that helps with whatever they turn their attention to. And you really can't put a price on things like that. Plus, all my kids have been raised within, 10-minute drive of all their grandparents. So that has been awesome. And I got a story here, but I think I'll just skip it for now. And when we get to questions, this one's a little bit more about my personal experiences going to school and so forth. So I'll skip it. But if you want to say, hey, tell me more about what was going on when you're going to elementary school, I'll be happy to share that one with you. It's more a way to show just a couple of tools to help navigate understanding things like racial dynamics and things like that. I think honestly, in America, we are so steeped in the culture of individualism, right? Like rugged individualism, up by your own bootstraps, carpe diem, seize the day. And we talk about, aside from the weather, what do you do, as if productivity is self-worth and things like that. And all of our emphasis on individualism has us thinking, like if somebody says, for example, there's an issue with sexism or patriarchy, then the men are tempted to think, well, if there's sexism because of individualism, there has to be a sexist. And if they're not looking at themselves, they must be looking at me. Wait a minute, I'm a good guy. And they show up defensive. And similarly, if we talk about race and say there's a problem with racism, then white people might be tempted to think, well, if there's racism, there has to be a racist. If they're not looking at themselves, they must be looking at me. Wait a minute, I'm a good person. And again, there's this inclination to be defensive because we receive it as an individual assessment rather than a statement about like patterns and policies. So for example, this kid was a foster kid. This was a few years ago, 2014. And his foster parents lived in Texas and they enroll him in school, but the public school, and this is pretty common across the Bible Belt, that there's a rule that says boys need a haircut above the collar. And the foster parents said, well, wait a minute, he's Native, he has long hair, this is part of their culture. And if, we have temporary placement, if we cut his hair, it could even be considered assault. It might traumatize him, but he has to go to school. What do you want us to do? And they said, well, if you can prove that he's an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe, and if you can authenticate that this is part of their religion, then we can petition the school board for a variance, which they did, and off he went to school. And so chances are there was nobody in that school district saying, let's make a policy to be hard on natives. There wasn't bad intention or bad individuals. They're probably thinking boys with short hair is normal. We want everybody to be normal. That way nobody gets teased. Or they're thinking it's Texas and we don't have enough money appropriated for education and it's hot here. Or we had problem with bugs last year, or whatever they're thinking. But it's probably not, how can we be mean to somebody? But it still has this effect. And so one of the things that I found helpful is that issues, when we're talking about really any of the isms, sexism, classism, racism, that it operates at multiple levels. So at the micro level, that's the individual acts, and they range from low level implicit bias to somebody doing something outrageous. And then at the meso level, there's like systems, policies, practices, and procedures. And then at the macro level, there's this kind of cultural smog that we're all breathing all the time. And it affects everything that we do. No matter how much we try to get in front of it, we still all have to navigate it. So I like to use this analogy sometimes, but if I hold up my finger and say, what is this? I might start a fight unless we clarify in what language, because in the language of body parts, indeed, that's a finger. But in the language of numbers, that's a 1. And in the language of space, that's up. So who's right? And of course, they're all right. It's a matter of language, context, perspective. And by the way, if we can get good at this, see this as a 1 and a finger and up and all the many things it means, that's what it means to have multiple perspectives, to get good at it, to be multicultural. And it's very helpful. It's good advice if you want to have a friend or be in a marriage or work in a workplace with more than 2 people. Chances are you're not going to agree on everything all the time. You can be married to somebody for 50 years in a row and they will still surprise you and give you something to argue about. So trying to find what is that perspective, help me understand, being curious about views and experiences different from your own is good medicine. And it's really helpful for navigating, especially around tough topics. All right, let's talk about everything you wanted to know about Indians, but were afraid to ask. I thought I'd share just briefly how I got into this project, which was entirely by accident. I finished high school with a thought that I think a lot of our high schoolers get, which is, I'm going to get out of here and never come back. That was my plan. So I got into Princeton University and I thought, hooray, everyone's going to be better educated. The brambled racial borderland of my youth will be behind me. And I got there and it was just so naive of me. But the first person I met said, oh, are you Native? Dude, where's your tomahawk? And I remember thinking, oh no, the brambled racial borderland is going to follow me wherever I go. And it took me, going a couple thousand miles away to figure that one out. Well, I stuck it out at Princeton and I actually had a great experience. My freshman year assigned roommate was a Sri Lankan citizen. We became besties and roomed together for 4 years in a row and were best men at each other's weddings and all that kind of stuff. And so sometimes those blind random things can be quite beautiful too. But I did get homesick. And by the time I finished college, my plan had completely reversed and it was to come home and never leave, which in the long run, I kind of pulled off. But while I was there being homesick, I heard that there was a Comanche spiritual leader that was coming out to the New Jersey woods near Princeton to run sweat lodge ceremonies. And, I was still pretty naive, but just wise enough to know that they're weirdos and Fruit Loops and people having culture for sale. And maybe this was something like that. But I thought, well, if it's anything like home, I'll go check it out. So I went out there and there were 2 big surprises. So first of all, as I pulled up, it was about 4 p.m, beautiful sunny day. And first surprise was that there were about 20 people waiting for the sweat lodge ceremony and they were all white. And then the second surprise was that they were all naked. And as I came pulling up, I had mixed feelings, honestly. Like part of me wanted to laugh because, it's 20 naked people standing around in the woods in the broad daylight. Like, what are you going to do? part of me wanted to run because, dang, there's 20 naked people standing around in the woods. And part of me was mad. Like, come on, is that what you think we're all about? Like, get naked, dance around a fire, or what? And so being naive, I opened the car door, I got out, and I was immediately folded into a tight embrace by one of these naked strangers who's now hugging me and saying, I'm so sorry what my people did to your people. So awkward. Now the desire to like laugh, run, get mad is growing. And I looked at this woman's face. She was an elder. There were tears welling up in her eyes. And it occurred to me, no matter how misguided she was, yes, she was misguided, that her emotional response was sincere. And if I just left, she'd keep on thinking whatever she's thinking. And if I got mad and told her off, the only native she met would be an angry one. And it's kind of unfair that this happens to people from marginalized groups, that you get asked to be the spokesperson for a whole group of people. Because I'm thinking, I got a house full of natives and I don't even know what they're thinking half the time. Like, how can anybody do that? But I had to think fast. And I said, ma'am, could you put some clothes on? Because I would love to talk to you about all of this. And she did. And we actually had a good talk. I think she learned a few things, but I did too. And among the things that I learned was that it's really important to make safe space, to do your best to give people a meaningful answer, not just an angry rebuke. And I could have called this book like Lessons from a Naked Stranger in the New Jersey Woods. Probably would have sold many more copies. But what I did then is I started to save the questions. Some were pretty common. Is it Indian, Native American, Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nation person, or what? Terminology. Some were about sovereignty. Some were about all kinds of topics in history, but also what's going on with Indigenous language revitalization. What is your culture like? What's a naming ceremony? What's a clan system? Sometimes there were things more wide ranging and searching. What's a Kachina doll and what does it mean and how do you use one? And then, of course, all the current events things. What do you think about Native people as mascots for sports teams? What do you think about Dakota Access Pipeline? What about Line 3? What about that guy having the confrontation at the Lincoln Memorial a few years ago with those kids from, Covington Catholic High School? What about that lady last year who was like teaching mathematics dressed in faux Native regalia, hopping around and getting all of the internet in an uproar? And so I started to save all these kinds of questions. And I realized that I knew what it was like living in this body, being kind of brown, having braids. Well, I guess I got a man bun in today, but I knew what that was like. But frankly, my mother, was an attorney, later became a judge. By the time I finished high school, I would have been pretty hard pressed to explain tribal sovereignty to somebody. I had to hunt for answers, and in many ways, I'm still searching. And so what I did is, as the questions came in, I started searching for the answers to them. And eventually that got me out speaking on this topic. And then eventually the book. There's a couple editions out now. There's kind of a made for adults one. And then we did a young reader edition that's kind of geared a little bit more for high school students, although I field tested everything on all of my kids. So from about 12 on up, they do pretty well with the young reader edition. What I'm going to do now is just open it up for your questions. I'm going to drop the PowerPoint for a bit, but I'll pull it back up because I've got tons more stuff in there if there are questions relative to something in the PowerPoint itself. And I'll open the chat and I'll start kind of filtering through and fielding some of these questions, and feel free to drop in more as we go. And we'll just have fun. When we run out of time, I put at the very top of the chat a link to my website. And on my website, there's, in addition to like contact information to get a hold of me, I've got lists of resources for teachers, free. So it includes just lists of Indigenous authored books, information on Indigenous language revitalization, I've got a YouTube channel, lots of free video shorts and things like that. So lots of ways to keep in touch and get more information. Yeah, so let me start fielding some of these. So one of them says, you mentioned you're from the eagle clan. Does that all correlate to a spirit animal? Does everyone have one, and how do those work? All right, so one of the things to mention, and I guess I should give you these couple of quick disclaimers. So one of them is that I'm one person and I only represent one person's view. So I'm impacted by all the things about me. That includes my age, gender, where I live, and so forth. So I only claim to represent myself. Sometimes there's a lot of diversity within the Native experience. So there are 574 different federally recognized tribes, and they all got their own languages, cultures, and ways of doing things. So I can speak a little bit to the clan system that I mentioned when I was introducing myself. And most of the Native American tribes have some sort of clan system, but it's the word can have different meanings in English. Like the Scottish clan system is mainly represented in last names and represents family groups, like the O'Hanlons lived here. But in the Ojibwe world, the clans are animals, birds, and fish. And it is kind of like a spirit guide where they're kind of like a guardian angel for your family or something like that. And it's also a symbol for your house. But one of the taboos in our culture is it's taboo to marry someone who is the same clan as you. So even if I met an Ojibwe person from 1,000 miles away, they're no biological relation at all. If they're from the same clan, they're like a brother or a sister and would have to treat them that way. So we sometimes joke around, like if you're out looking for a date, instead of saying, "Hey baby, what's your sign?" it should be more like, "Hey baby, what's your clan?" So that's a little bit on the clan system. Yeah, and so there's another one about residential boarding schools. And there's a lot to say about those. My grandmother went to residential boarding school. That's my mom's mom. And my mom did not go to residential boarding school. I did not, and none of my children have either. So I would say in the United States, that's pretty typical, my experience, that the grandparent generation has had the boarding school experience, but that most of the parent and child generation have not. In Canada, the system started a little bit later and ended a little more recently. So there, in addition to the grandparent generation, some significant number of the parent generation have also had a residential boarding school experience. And I see your question is more about how does that relate in your family? So I'll kind of leave it at that. But if anyone wants me to, I'm happy to kind of break down a little more on the history of boarding schools or speak to truth and reconciliation as it's happened in Canada, or what I would love to see us do in the US. So by all means, feel free to drop in more questions and I'll extend that part of the conversation too. I see here there's another question about fasting on the spirit level. How is attaching identity to the spirit world? All right, so a couple things about fasting. So this custom has some variation across different Native communities, but many of the tribes, especially in the Great Lakes and the northern and southern plains, have a custom where someone will give up their food and water, and they'll also give up the company of other people, and they'll be placed out on a fast, and usually in a more remote area. Sometimes it's an elevated area, like some people in our area will do things like build a little platform in a tree, kind of like an eagle's nest. It's not way at the top, but just enough to be several feet off the ground, and that's where they'll do their fast. And as you give up your food, water, your body starts to, it takes it a couple days to detox, like just from sugar, caffeine, whatever. And then as your body slows down, you get a lot more tired, and people start to dream. And sometimes what somebody sees when they're fasting in their dreams and so forth will be considered a sign that can kind of point them in directions in their life. So Somebody might have dreams that they use for, giving native names to other people. Somebody might dream about a medicine or a song. And one of the things that I kind of really appreciate about a lot of native cultures is that instead of a big institution like, a Catholic church or something like that, there's no institution that governs spirituality. And so anybody can be the most important somebody for sharing some kind of cultural knowledge. And so there's a high level of individual spiritual empowerment with those things. It doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want, but that's a little bit on fasting. And I've been fasting, and my older kids have been fasting. Some of the younger ones haven't yet, but plan to. And I think that it's really, it's kind of a beautiful experience. As much as anything, just not being in the company of humans for an extended period of time. Most of us are just inundated with, technology and constant human company. And when you spent some time in the woods, eventually the animals and birds get used to you. And, you can tell just how busy the woods are and feel okay being there. And it's kind of helped me feel okay just being in my own body as much as anything. And of course, some people have very powerful spiritual experiences out there too that can be quite formative. And I did have an experience like that. And I know a lot of other people have too. I see Diana's got one here. What is the meaning of Mitakuye-osin? So Mitakuye-osin is a statement that comes out of the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota languages. For those who don't know, the groups sometimes called Sioux are really three major dialect groupings: the D dialect Dakota, N dialect Nakota, and L dialect Lakota. They're all cousins to one another, and there are other dialect variations within those groups. But within all of those languages, Mitakuye-osin means all my relatives. And it's kind of a way of saying we are all related to one another. Not just all of us humans being related to one another, but we are all part of creation. Instead of man is given dominion over the earth, it's almost the opposite. We are part of the web of life rather than its masters. And so it's just kind of an invocation of that oneness to everything in creation. And for Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota people, it's a common way of, ending a speech or a prayer to just as a reminder, hey, we are all related. Question: have I visited the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg? Yes, I have. It is indeed amazing. For those who haven't been there, I would certainly recommend it. I was really impressed with the way it was structured, in addition to the content of the exhibits. So on the first floor, there were many, many stories, and some of them really took me by surprise. So, there was a big section on the Canadian residential boarding school system and its treatment of Indigenous people in Canada. This was something that I did know a lot about when I came there, but I thought the way it was displayed, the images and so forth, were really pretty engaging and sensitively done and informative. But I had no idea that the Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted in Canada, but they had a little section on that. There was another one that talked about the internment of Japanese Canadians in Canada. And I'd heard about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. I had no idea that the Canadians did the same thing. And there were numerous different exhibits. And by the time you went through the first floor, I think everybody who came there would see themselves reflected in the exhibits at some point. And then the second floor was kind of about how humans got to the point of like engaging in genocide. There was more on the Nazi Holocaust and things like that. But the third floor was about human beings who have made a difference in human rights. So there was stuff on Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and many other stories of those who've triumphed through adversity in the quest for humanizing all of us. And it started to feel pretty inspiring to think people can change things and can make a difference. And then the top floor is all about the visitor. And so there were kiosks and portals that said, do you have a story that is not reflected in this exhibit somewhere? Tell your story right now, and it can become part of the National Canadian Record. Do you want to get involved? And they had tons of information on different human rights organizations, social activism. And so it kind of took you from seeing yourself in history to seeing the broad span of history, to seeing people changing history, to yourself like being the change. And so I thought it was just really well designed, certainly worth a visit if you're in the Winnipeg area. Yeah, so more questions here. Did your mother ever talk about her frustrations as a multiple minority person working in law? Oh, yes, for sure. Yeah, she was, my mother was a bit of a fireball. She wasn't super easily intimidated, but she had to go up against all kinds of things. And she had a partner when she started her private law practice, Paul Day, who's still around. He's a great guy. And he had two long braids. And eventually his hair was thinning and he said, to heck with it. And he cut his hair. And one of the judges said, oh, Mr. Day, you finally look like an attorney, And so what that meant is that this judge who had decided numerous cases that my mom and Paul had argued would look at them and think, not legitimate attorneys, And the degree to which that may have affected the rulings and everything else, there's just no way to fully know. And so, yes, she ran into different kinds of adversity. I think as a woman too, in a very male-dominated space, people would sometimes talk down to her, patronize her, once in a while, call an inappropriate name or something like that. And, she could hold her own when things like that happen, but nobody should have to deal with that. And so, I think some of the adversity helped her strengthen her musculature for dealing with it. But at the same time, yeah, it wasn't always pretty, but I think she's somebody who really genuinely earned an awful lot of respect from her colleagues. And she did a lot of good, within her career. And so, yeah, I'm pretty proud of the way she both showed up as well as what she did. Yeah, so here's another question about cultural activities and where would I find info about that? So there are all kinds of ways and places to do that. So I could point you to one. I got a new book out. It's called The Cultural Toolbox, Traditional Ojibwe Living in the Modern World. And it's kind of more personal journey through how we try to live our culture. The Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe has a website and a newspaper that has a regular place where some of their tribal elders will say, here's what a naming ceremony is and how it works. And, here's, the customs for when kids come of age and become men or women. And so some of those articles are in little cultural snippets are really authentic and useful. Lee Staples, who sometimes informs some of those articles, he also has some YouTube videos out about naming a child and things like that. And those are easy, free ways to get a little more information about it. And there are many, many Native people who are trying to get their voices out there in different contexts. So I think, as a general rule of thumb, I think the Indigenous authored and Native led efforts to say, here's what we want you to know about our culture are going to be well received. And that says you're in safe space and you don't have to worry about cultural appropriation or something like that. The Native imagined things like, let's play Native, those can get on thinner ice. But if you're paying attention to Native voices, Native led efforts, you'll be pretty safe and well led with your learning efforts. All right, so here's another one saying, when people come up and say, what do you do? What a ridiculous question. I know this was for so many different reasons, and I've always said this to my kids too, that there are 1,000 definitions of success. And you don't have to pick any one that I come up with. You pick one that is meaningful to you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be career focused or whatever. One of my cousins, he never had a job. It sounds ridiculous to some people, but he picked pine cones. And that sounds ridiculous until you realize that he made between $5,000 and $7,000 a year just picking pine cones. He trapped, he harvested leeches and minnows for bait for fishermen. That guy was making like $100K a year. If you asked him, what do you do? He says, I don't know, I hang out in the woods. But ultimately, it's not even the financial success that made him successful. He was doing what really mattered to him. And I find, my wife and I have had so many conversations about this sort of stuff too. My dad, when my mom launched her career, was a stay-at-home dad for a number of years. And then as the kids got older, he was writing books and doing other things. And I think the freedom to say, all right, this is how I want to spend my time. It doesn't always have to be career focused. And I think some of that is also, in addition to being focused on individualism in mainstream America, we're also very focused on materialism. And so, hey, it doesn't always have to have financial value to have value. It's an important reminder. Yeah, so somebody dropped the website in there. Thank you. When a person is Native American and another culture, how can they walk in both worlds, or should they? Well, I don't know. For me, for starters, I love all the parts about me. My Jewish father, my Native American mother, and there's some even mathematical equation to everything in my mom's heritage too. So I love all the parts of me. I love all the parts of my kids. And I think it's possible to honor all the parts of who we are. At the same time, we can choose to some degree how we want to be, but it's harder to choose all the time how other people will other us. Because like if I said for a white guy like me, it's kind of hard to understand. People would say, wait, what? Even though I'm just as white as I am Native, because color shows up. And for the Native population, we're racially diverse, we're complex. So, some people may look Black, may look white, might look brown or look racially ambiguous, but still have a strong Native identity, culture, consciousness, how they see themselves. So, I do think it's important to empower everybody to kind of metabolize all of the pieces to their ancestry and construct a life that gives them the greatest meaning. But at the same time, connection to community and knowledge of culture, these things matter too. And so for a lot of people, we've had 1/3 of our people have been adopted and fostered out of our communities and families. Well, they have a right to come back and reconnect and learn about their culture. It's not through any fault of their own that they didn't get to grow up with that handed on a silver platter. Between residential boarding schools and all kinds of other assaults on our languages and cultures, a lot of people have been disconnected from those things. So a lot of Native people are in a reclaiming effort. So I think we should have permission, to lean into those things. At the same time, there is a tension about cultural continuity on the one hand and cultural change on the other. All cultures change over time. In fact, if you even just tried to read Geoffrey Chaucer, one of the first guys to write in English, I think my English is pretty good, but I can barely read that stuff. And that was only 600 years ago. So languages like English and all of them, they're always changing over time. So on the one hand, we have permission to change over time. That doesn't make us inauthentic. At the same time, how much can a people change and still be the same people? At some point, the Druids who were putting blue on their faces to worship at Stonehenge became different from everybody else, and separated from that as they became modern Englishmen, and the DNA is consistent and connected, but the cultural practice shifted so much that they were almost unrecognizable to one another. And we see this in a place like Wisconsin or Minnesota, where about a third of the people are of German heritage and might have a nice vacation back in Germany, but really feel most at home when they come back to the North Woods. And there's a difference between having German DNA and being a Deutschlander. So other things like language, culture, connection to community also do matter. But I'm really trying to be careful about kind of trying to out Indian somebody or shame somebody for what they don't know or didn't get access to. I believe that human beings should be treated with kindness and respect, and that our values include things like inclusivity and things like that. So that's how I try to live my life. And, when I'm put in a gatekeeper role around ceremonies or things like that, that's kind of my disposition towards that. I'll say one more thing, just because it's a good question about like living in two worlds. And I do hear a lot of people say that there's two worlds, there's our native world and the rest of the world. But in many ways, I kind of feel like it's still just one world. If I have a non-native person over for supper, they don't have to abandon their culture to come experience some time with my family. We shouldn't have to abandon ours to navigate the non-native world. So it's okay if we're like, it's one world, and we don't have to code switch to make it out there. We can be exactly who we are and thrive. So that's certainly what I try to do in my life. But of course, there's pressure. The better I am at whiteness, the better off I do, and I realize how I get treated by others. And it makes such a difference what clothes I'm wearing and so forth. This, by the way, isn't a wall ornament. It's part of my powwow outfit, and if I'm wearing that, it's a whole different experience how people look at me and treat me and things like that. Yeah, so another good question here. Let's see, Lisa. We live in Polk County near Balsam Lake, very interested in ancient routes. Do you know what route Archie Moset's father took to cross the river and walk to Balsam, or maybe someone who knows the old routes? Well, first of all, I spend a lot of time in Polk County too, because I come out to Round Lake on the St. Croix Reservation for ceremonies. And then Archie's children, including Dan Moset and Dora Ammon, both live right in Balsam Lake. And when I was spending a lot of time with Archie, we spent a lot of time, not just at his house, but cruising around in the woods and stuff like that. So if you're familiar with that area, there's a little section of tribal housing that's just south of the main village of Balsam Lake. And there's an access road that goes down the hill. And there are actually springs bubbling up all around at the base of the hill, running into the Balsam branch and then down, they all feed basically into the St. Croix system. And so there are trails in there. And Archie's father, Mike Moset, grew up in Mille Lacs in the McGregor kind of area, Sandy Lake area in Minnesota. And he used to walk for 3 days to come over to the Ojibwe village at Balsam Lake, which is at the base of that hill where all the springs were. And he'd walk 3 days over there. And then when he got there, then his future wife's family would let the two of them have a walk, and her aunties would walk some paces behind and watch to make sure they were behaving themselves. And he had to keep that up for some time. And eventually they said, okay, you can get married. And they were like 18 and 19 years old, and they got married, and he moved there permanently and started his family over there. Yes, there's another question here. How introduced to Native life through the mother? I'm not sure I understand that question. If it's mainly like whose responsibility is it to introduce culture to kids? To me, for the most part, it is a village-based approach to the raising of children. It's not necessarily formally designated as the mother's or father's responsibility or someone else. In historic Native communities, you would often have grandparents, aunts, uncles actively engaged in the day-to-day, teaching, instruction, and provisioning of children in a family. And extended family was a probably more important network than just the nuclear family. That doesn't mean that the mother and father did not have jobs, duties, and responsibilities, but simply that it was a more collective and communal effort. And a lot of times people simply grew up with their cousins, almost like siblings, in that extended family network. For many of us, like for me, we kind of almost have a Leave It to Beaver type family situation over here, mom, dad, and pile of kids. But we try to invoke our entire village and network with everything we do. So, one of my daughters actually just had her first menstrual period, and it marks a year of ceremonies. So over at the house right now, one of her aunties and namesakes have come to visit. Her grandma will come to visit, and they'll be giving her teachings and things like that. And so relying on the whole village is something that's really, I think, very empowering with all of that. Yeah, there's lots of good questions here. So here's another one. What would you like to see done in the US about truth and reconciliation? I would really love to see us do something like the Canadians did, where, there was an effort to do some truth telling, like truth and reconciliation begins with truth. And we can't get to reconciled and skip reconciling, and we can't get to healed and skip the healing. I read the Desmond Tutu book, The Book of Forgiving, which, by the way, I could recommend. It's awesome. So many inspiring stories. There's a woman in there who starts a peace institute with the men who murdered her daughter, and she works with them every single day. And I just still can't even quite imagine the grace to work with people who killed your kid, but they do. And it's pretty inspiring. In there, Desmond Tutu offers kind of a simple to say, but not necessarily simple to do, process for healing and forgiveness. And what he says is that when there's been an injury, and this applies to the big historical injuries, in his case, he's working on apartheid, but it also applies to individual ones. And he'll say, first of all, when some injury has happened, the injured party needs to tell the story. The injured party needs to tell the story and have that story received. And then they need to put a name on the injury. This was genocide or whatever it was. Then you can work on forgiveness. And forgiveness doesn't mean saying it's okay. That means saying this happened. We can't change that it happened, and we accept it. And then you get to the decision to either renew or release the relationship. So an example with regards to like individual injury, let's say some guy goes out and cheats on his wife, then he wants to reconcile the relationship. He's not going to get very far saying, forget about it, that all happened in the past. What happens is that the injured party, in this case, the wife, would need to tell the story. This is how that felt. This is what that meant to me. And this is the name that was betrayal or whatever. Then there can be an acceptance/forgiveness process, and then she'll either renew or release the relationship, a divorce or a reconciliation. But if she's not allowed to tell that story, you're guaranteed that there will be a lot of pain for both parties, and you'll definitely be heading for the divorce, right? This is the same with national injuries. In a place like America, slavery, genocide of Native people, residential boarding schools. And America has not done a good job of holding space for any aggrieved party to even tell their story. We play like shut up politics. As soon as someone says, hey, you know, there's a problem with slavery, let's talk about the 1619 Project. The politicians and the pundits are saying, shut up, don't tell that, you know? And what that does is it stops the healing and the reconciling. And so the injury keeps coming up. And this is, by the way, like, let's say you want to reach out to the Native Parent Committee for a school, and sometimes you can do a convening, and the first thing someone wants to talk about is like residential boarding schools. And someone's confused, like, why do they want to talk about that? I thought we were trying to talk about how we're all on the same page, caring about the kids. But what it means is there's an injury there that has not been properly voiced and received. So there's a lot of healing and holding space for someone to share their story. And so what I think a meaningful truth and reconciliation effort would look like would be something that provides an opportunity for many people to share their stories and to document those things and have them be part of the national record as a means of expunging pain and starting genuine healing. And that would be the truth-seeking part of the work. And then the reconciling would be coming together and thinking about what would it look like, since we can't undo all of the things that happened, what would it look like to do some new things that would bring us together in the interests of justice? And that could include, for example, in Canada, they've done things like appropriated funding for Indigenous language revitalization. And, you know, it's beyond apologies, but there have been apologies and there have been land acknowledgements, which I support. But that can just be window dressing if that's all that happens. So I think the more meaningful actions are the ones that say, okay, we're gonna try to center some of the marginalized or oppressed voices and people in ways that enable them to tell us what justice could look like. And I think that it's not always a comfortable conversation, but it's one that produces genuine healing. And it's kind of like, if you want to get stronger, you know, go to the gym. But working out is not always comfortable. Sometimes you're going to be sore. But if you go back again and again, you can get acclimated to that. And the workout, even though it gets you a little sore, can actually feel good. And you look forward to it. And if you habituate to it, it'll really make you stronger. And this is an area where America has been very weak. We need some time in the gym. We need to hold space for each other. We need to hear one another's stories. Instead of shouting at one another or talking at one another, we need to genuinely listen to one another. We could take all those people we want to give a good talking to and give them a good listening to. All right. So there are all kinds of more good questions here. Let's see. Did you practice any Jewish traditions growing up? Yes, my father did. Hanukkah, Passover, we participated in those things too. I did grow up, you know, in a Native community looking brown, and my mom bringing us to ceremonies. Those things are very impactful for me. But certainly my father showed us what he could of his ways, and we embraced those. He's gone now, but, you know, even though I still like, you know, I even officiate at Ojibwe ceremonies, but we light up a menorah on Hanukkah and we honor my father and the traditions that he taught us. And I don't see any contradiction between that and what we do in our Native cultural toolbox. Comment on land acknowledgements. Sure, you know, this is something a lot of organizations have been working on. And this really came out of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation you know, action items, recommended action items list. And so what I think is cool about land acknowledgements, sometimes as Indigenous people, we experience hypervisibility, racial profiling or something like that. But a lot of times we also experience invisibility and marginalization. And so what a land acknowledgement can do is get in front of the invisibility and say, we see you. Nuts and bolts. And by the way, I've got a longer piece on my YouTube channel on land acknowledgements if you want some kind of 101 tutorial on what to do and not to do. But I think the biggest things for a good land acknowledgement is that, first of all, it will be locally specific. So, in your area on the St. Croix Valley, I think you would acknowledge, the Ojibwe and the Dakota, as indigenous groups. And depending on where on the St. Croix you are, you might be more towards Dakota territory or more, north towards Ojibwe territory. But I think you would acknowledge both. And you would also acknowledge historical injustice, but also contemporary, survivance, thriving. So that way we're not just sugarcoating things, and we're not just talking about tragedy and trauma, but there's an acknowledgement of both. And then there will be some sort of institutional call to action. We will fight racism in all its forms, or something like that. And the other things are not too much complicated terminology and keep it short. So that's always a big challenge with the wordsmithing, but you want it to be short enough so that it's not cumbersome to read it at the start of events, or like at our university, we're asking all of the professors to put it on a syllabus and things like that. So that's kind of the goal. And I found that it's not just getting the land acknowledgement right, but the process that you use to develop it is often very healthy, because you start thinking about all the things. Who is here? Who has been here? Who should we acknowledge? What do we say about historical injustice? What do we say about, people still thriving and doing well? And what is our institutional call to action? And those are great questions to have for any organization that can kind of, just help people focus on making and being change. Could you speak on land reparations? How do we do that? Do you see that happening in our country, and how is that part of reconciliation? So great question. So first of all, reparations may be a topic that has had some controversy to it, because it rubs some people the wrong way to, devote resources to an aggrieved party. Americans want to think you got to go earn it all in work. But I think there is a meaningful way to do reparations, and especially around land. So here's what I've seen happen. I sit on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society. For those who aren't familiar, in 1862, the US Dakota War was a, horrendous event for everybody involved. And, the Minnesota governor issued an order for the expulsion of the Dakota from the state of Minnesota. And that order's never been properly rescinded. But just this past year, the Minnesota State Historical Society worked out an arrangement to repatriate a land parcel to the Dakota. And it was right where at the, Upper Sioux Agency where the event first began. And the tribal chairman we had to do a Zoom call instead of an in-person event, but he was on that meeting and saying, my dad said this would never, ever, ever happen. But it happened. And he was overwhelmed. He was crying and truly grateful. And the kind of stodgy members of the Minnesota Historical Society, I think, were also quite moved. And it was less about like so many thousands of acres, it was a small parcel, but it was a symbolic one that had great meaning, and I think advanced the effort of healing and justice. Also, just this past year, on the Leech Lake Reservation, where I'm from, if you look at a map, you're like, wow, that's a big chunk of territory. It's almost 40 miles by 40 miles, until you realize that Native people own 4% of their own reservation. 85% of the reservation is the Chippewa National Forest. And so there are a lot of ways to skin a cat or take land from natives, and they found all the ways. So just this past year, they repatriated some thousands of acres to the tribe. And the tribe was really appreciative of that for a number of reasons. We're in an impoverished area. We have a lot of tribal harvesters. A national forest is different from a national park. The national forest cut down all the trees. And, you know, so it's devastating for like people who want to do things like run a maple sugar bush if, you know, it takes decades for a maple tree to mature. And so this way the tribe can protect the resources better than the federal government can, and help strengthen and preserve indigenous harvest practices. So some of these land back efforts, when done right, can really advance justice, and they're not taking anything away from any non-native people. And it's not really about the money or something like that. So there is a call for this, and there is some emerging precedent for what that could look like. The successful ones I've seen so far, for the most part, have focused on parcel repatriation to tribes rather than to individuals. But I do think that this is a growing conversation, and there's plenty of resistance as well as some growing support. So it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out in the years to come. So more questions here. Let's see. Individualism as a native Ojibwe when living in a community. Yeah, so this is just a question about kind of philosophy and cultural practice. Honestly, I feel like for most of human history, all of us humans from all cultures have survived, not because we were competing with the person in the lodge next to us, or better than the person in the lodge next to us, or more distinguished than the person in the lodge next to us. We survived because the person in the lodge next to us loved us, and loved us enough to go face the cave bear or the saber-toothed tiger or whatever and protect us. We have gotten by because we were connected in community. And it's been very new, just since the birth of the agricultural age, that people have accumulated different levels of wealth, abandoned earth-based worldviews and religious practices in favor of more institutionalized ones that are tied to politics. And, you know, I think those things have served some purposes. I could point you to the Yuval Harari book, Sapiens, which I thought was brilliant. You know, A Brief History of Humankind, and really some challenging and well-designed thoughts in there. It's a fantastic book. But these are kind of new developments in the history of humans, and it's part of what drives a lot of our angst today. Well, our societies now, for the most part, through colonization and so forth, have been forced to focus on and value individualism, competition, and materialism. Our psychological and emotional framework is hardwired to seek connection and community. And so we feel quite unsatisfied. Like, you can look at all the folks in Hollywood who get all of the individual distinction and wealth and are so psychologically isolated that they're numbing their pain with substance abuse and shortening their lives and things like that. And although that's maybe a pretty brutal generalization, having money is no guarantee of happiness. The absence of it can make you miserable in this day and age, but ultimately the happiness dividend drops off after a certain level of financial attainment. And it's because we need these other things, the human connection and relationship building and opportunities to grow and so forth. All right. So here's a few more, and I'll probably have time to really field maybe a couple more of these. Whatever I don't get to, don't feel bad. Aside from the possibility of doing another one of these sometime, I could also mention on my website, I've got a list of events, and sometimes a lot of them are still virtual in this day and age. And then they're scattered all over the country. So there'd be a lot of opportunities to directly engage and lots of other free stuff that I can point you to there. So let's take a couple more. I've lived closely with Native Americans in Minnesota my whole life, and I'm embarrassed how little I understand of Native lives and history. What do you recommend I do to learn more? It's a great question, and it's a humble way to frame it. So I really appreciate that, Kirsten. All of us have plenty that we can learn. And I think once we know enough to know that there are things we don't know, then it's just time to lean in and, seek out Native voices, books, articles, YouTube videos, documentaries. There's so many different ways to connect. And then because we're more segregated than we were before desegregation, most of us have a racially homogenous favorites list on our smartphone, then we have to take ourselves out of our comfort zone. This is the most it bumps into our Minnesota nice training, to be so conflict averse that we're communication averse, get a new neighbor, drop off a casserole, give them their space kind of thing. But it's okay to embrace a certain level of discomfort. When we bring a child into the world, we do not expect that experience to be comfortable. And I'm not just talking about the birthing, but we know that there will be crying babies, fevers, puke, poop, ornery teenagers. And you know what? Being a parent can be one of the most beautiful experiences in a person's life because we fall in love with our kid. What would it look like if we fell in love with justice? What would it look like if we genuinely, not just as a performative line, but if we genuinely loved our neighbors? We would be so motivated to learn what we needed to know about them and to look out for them as well as our own kids. And I think that'd make the world a lot better place. It doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean it's comfortable any more than raising a kid is comfortable, but it is worthwhile and fulfilling for individuals and for everybody. Instead of kicking the problems down the road like an old rusty can, we can pick them up and fix a lot of these things and bequeath to our children a kinder, fairer, better world. So I think that is certainly worth the effort. All right, I can see there are 45 more messages after as far as I got in, in the chat here. So I'm going to have to leave some of those on the table. And they're just really, really great questions. Of course, I answer plenty of them in the book, but sometimes I will be surprised or stumped on something. So I can see there's some good ones on cultural appropriation, more regionally specific ones. Why don't I handle that one on cultural appropriation real quick, because it's a common one that comes up. And I did mention earlier in the talk that if you seek out activities and sources of information that are Indigenous led, usually you'll be on pretty sure ground. If it's Native inspired, then you run into trouble. And there's kind of a reckoning going on with summer camps and, school curricula and things like that. Holy crap, we've gotten this stuff wrong. We've been playing Indian too much. We need to, listen to, and follow the lead of Indigenous people. That's a general rule of thumb, but there's a little gray area in between, and different people may draw the lines in different ways. This is honestly like if you're working for a school or a community organization or something like that, it's really good if you get an Indigenous advisory group or if there's a Native parent committee. Those are great places to bring questions to. What do you want us to use for terminology? Where would you draw the boundaries with regard to cultural appropriation on this topic? How can we do better to hold up and bring in Native voices and let everybody learn about themselves as well as the rest of the world in a way that won't be appropriative? And you'll get good advice, and you'll also just more directly engage your own stakeholders in your communities. And that's going to be good for them, good for you, and good for their relationships. All right, I better quit. You have been so wonderful. I just want to thank you for your kind time and attention, all the wonderful questions, and keep leaning in, keep being curious, keep asking the questions, and together we'll make it a better place. Miigwech.
Right. And Heather's going to mention some more events that are coming up in case you are interested in any of the further programming we've got going on this month as part of Big Read.
Mm-hmm.
First, Anton, Treuer, I want to thank you so much for sharing your cultural wisdom with us and your evening with us as part of the Big Read. So thank you so much. And thanks everybody for logging on and joining us this evening with the Stillwater Public Library and our other partners on this event, which include the Bayport Public Library, the Hudson Area Public Library, Northwoods and Waters of the St. Croix Heritage Area, and the St. Croix Falls Public Library. So if you are a reader from one of those communities, thank you also for joining us. There's another event that I want to mention that will be really the culminating event, the very end of the month on April 29th. You'll find me and Aurora down at the Zephyr Theater for documentary film screenings with two Native women created documentaries and another video from the Native American Student Alliance from Stillwater High School. So definitely come down. It's another free event and it's April 29th. And you can find out about all of these events online and in the Big Read brochure and at your local library. So thank you again for this evening and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Treuer. Appreciate it. It was so great.